A teenage boy is driving down a back road. It's empty, it's dark. Then something caught his headlights. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. He'd never seen anything like it, and he wasn't the only one. Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13, your weekly paranormal podcast where every week we go poking around the back roads of your town so you don't have to. I'm your host, Matt, and today takes us to the year 1977, about 15 miles outside of Boston. What happened in Dover wasn't your typical Bigfoot sighting that spans decades across multiple states. This was different, concentrated, and intense. 4 separate encounters with something unexplainable, all happening within a 2-mile radius, all described by teenagers who had no reason to lie and depicting the same impossible creature. Welcome to the story of the Dover Demon. So let me paint you a picture of what makes the Dover Demon case so unique. Now, most famous cryptids, your Bigfoot, your Loch Ness Monster, your Jersey Devil, they're legends built over centuries, with sightings scattered across years or even decades. They become part of the local folklore, passed down through generations. But the Dover Demon, it showed up, it terrorized 4 teenagers over 2 nights, and then it just vanished forever. And when you plot the sighting locations on a map, they form a straight line across town. Like whatever this thing was, it had a specific route, a purpose, and then nothing. There was no copycat sightings, there's no hoaxes trying to capitalize on the attention, and no follow-up encounters despite all the media coverage that followed it. That's what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating. It's a perfect little self-contained, unsolvable mystery. It's April 21st, 1977. The dashboard clock glows 10:28 p.m. as 17-year-old Bill Bartlett grips the steering wheel of his Volkswagen Beetle, driving north on Farm Street with his friends Mike Mazzacco and Andy Brody. Typical teenagers talking about, school, girls, weekend plans, the whole works. And this normal conversation is about to be changed forever. And Bill's hands rest easy on the wheel, almost just guiding him along the road through muscle memory. He's driven this road so many times. As Bill's headlights cut through the darkness ahead, just lighting up the familiar road that he's driven so many times before, something catches his eye. Something that really shouldn't be there. He sees what he first thinks might be a dog or a cat on the broken stone wall up ahead, but as his headlights hit it fully, he realizes it's not an ordinary animal. Standing on this wall is a creature that's about 4 feet tall. Its skin is peach-colored with a texture that Bill would later describe as like wet sandpaper. But it's the head that really concerns Bill. It's this massive egg-shaped head completely out of proportion with its thin, spindly body. There's no nose that Bill can see, no mouth either, no ears, just that giant head with 2 large eyes, something that really kind of haunted Bill for the rest of this time after seeing this. There are 2 perfect circles, easily the size of a baseball or a softball, taking up most of the creature's face. And they have no visible pupils, no irises, no whiteness to the eyes, just 2 glowing orange orbs that Bill would later describe as like 2 glowing orange marbles. And they were glowing at him, not reflecting the light of the headlights, but the eyes themselves were glowing. And they were staring directly at him, not at the car, not at the headlights, but at Bill through the windshield, straight into him. And as Bill's watching this thing staring at him through the windshield, it doesn't move. It doesn't flee like an animal would when it sees a car coming. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't blink. And Bill has this kind of weird sense that, maybe it can't blink with those eyes. He doesn't see eyelids or anything like that. And the encounter only lasted a couple seconds. Bill's car approached. The creature turns and looks at him with those glowing eyes. And then as Bill drives past, his friends didn't see it. Bill immediately turns around to go back, but the creature's gone at this point. He gets home when Mike and Andy kind of encourage him to draw what he saw, and Bill was a pretty accomplished artist. He went on to today being a career artist where you can purchase his artwork and everything on his website. He's a very talented artist. And he creates a sketch that night that will become one of the most famous cryptid illustrations ever. And on that drawing, he writes something that shows just how deeply this affected him. And he writes, I, Bill Bartlett, swear on a stack of Bibles that I saw this creature. And just 2 hours after Bill's sighting, around 12:30 a.m., technically April 22nd now, 15-year-old John Baxter is walking home alone on Miller Road. Honestly, I'm not sure why a 15-year-old is walking home by himself at 12:30 at night. But again, it's 1977 in a small town, so things are a little bit different. And he's just walking home like he's done many times. He's walked this road before. He knows this path. He knows everyone in the town, so he's just walking on his way home. And as he's walking, kind of preoccupied with thoughts of a normal 15-year-old boy about, his girlfriend and school and things like that, he notices a small figure walking towards him from the darkness up ahead. At first, it doesn't really register as anything unusual. Dover is the kind of place where people take evening walks, where neighbors might be taking the dog out or coming home from a late night shift. And it's still maybe 100 feet away from, just at the edge of the furthest streetlight's reach from where you can see. But something about the way it's moving, it kind of strikes John as odd. It's just got this weird gait to how it's walking. It just feels kind of wrong somehow. Just not quite human, but not quite animal. And it's moving with kind of a strange, like rolling motion, like someone who hasn't learned how to walk properly. So John yells out to see who it is, and he gets no answer, no response at all. It just keeps moving towards him. And by this point, John can now see it more clearly in the dim streetlight up ahead. And they're both just kind of standing there staring at each other for a couple seconds, just kind of eyeing each other down and trying to make sense of what they're looking at. And then in an instant, the creature just takes off running. But it's not a normal run or walk. It drops into what can really only be described as kind of a scurrying run. Its long, skinny limbs are moving in this like spider-like coordination that just makes John's skin kind of crawl at how awkward and unsettling it looks. And it doesn't run away from him down the road, like turn around and run the other way. It runs off to the side down the woods into the darkness. And John would later describe this moment, realizing he was looking at something not human or animal, but kind of something in between. Said the creature suddenly changes direction, scurrying off to the left down into a wooded gully. John's rational side of his mind is telling him to run, leave this thing alone, go home, run home, get away from this thing. But again, he's 15 and 15-year-olds sometimes do stupid things. His adrenaline's pumping, he's curious, so he decides to go after it and follow it. He stops at the top of the gully and peers down, and about 30 feet away, sitting near a tree, is the creature. And John really can't get a good look at it. It's too dark at the moment. He just came from the streetlights down into the woods, and then the streetlights aren't super bright, but they're bright enough that it takes your eyes a moment to adjust. And when they do, he sees the creature just sitting motionless next to a large oak tree that's about 20 feet away down at the bottom of the gully. But from this angle, John's able to get a much better look at it. And he sees this creature just remarkably similar to what Bill saw. It's got the oversized head sitting on this impossibly thin neck, like a giant balloon. The difference here is that the eyes that John saw weren't glowing like the eyes that Bill saw, but the shape and description of them outside of the glowing are pretty identical. He says it almost looked kind of like a monkey, just stretched and distorted. If someone like took a chimpanzee and pulled it like kind of through a taffy machine and just stretched it all out. But what he noticed at this point is that the feet aren't actually resting on the ground. He's on a rock, but they're wrapped around it and kind of molded to its surface, almost like they're made of clay and just kind of molded into the rock that it's on, not just regular toes or feet that are just sitting on top, but actually appeared to be a kind of part of the rock that it was standing on. And it just stands there and looks at him in this darkness. They're just staring at each other across the gully. It doesn't move. It doesn't make any noise. They're just looking at each other across this gully. And this feels like an eternity for John, but it's really only probably about 30 seconds of them standing there staring at each other. And John's getting a little more and more nervous at this point, and he sees the creature's head kind of tilt a little bit, like kind of like a dog does when it's looking at you and it tips its head to the side. And that's when he decides he's done checking this thing out. He's too afraid, and the terror finally overcomes his curiosity, and he scrambles back away up the hill and back out to the road, just running to get home. And he doesn't stop running until he sees some headlights approaching of a car turning onto Miller Road from Oak Street. And without thinking, he's just kind of waving his arms frantically, trying to get the car to stop and talk to him. And this middle-aged couple pulls up in this car, and John didn't recognize them, but at this point, he didn't really care. He just needed someone to help. And the woman in the passenger seat asks him if he's okay, that he looks terrified. And he goes to try and tell them what he saw, but he doesn't. Because how do you actually explain that to someone that you've just met for the first time in the middle of the night? So he just tells them, I need to get home. I just need to get home. Can you give me a ride, please? So the couple looks at each other for a few seconds, kind of surveying the situation going on and how scared this boy is. And they decide to give him a ride home. So John hops in the back seat and they drive him back to his house. When they drop him off, John thanks them over and over, watches them drive away down the road before he finally locks the front door of his house and goes back inside. And at this point, John decides he's going to draw this creature as well. And the drawing that he creates is not quite as good as Bill's. John is not as good of an artist as Bill was, but it is unmistakably the exact same creature that Bill had just seen 2 hours earlier. Now, John had no idea that just across town, another teenager has drawn almost the exact same picture. He had no idea of knowing that this happened. Again, it's 1977. They don't have cell phones, and John and Bill were not particularly good friends. They were a couple years different in age, and usually, high school age kids, the 17-year-olds aren't usually in the same social circles as the 15-year-olds. So not only did they not have cell phones or ways to communicate, they also didn't really know each other very well to even be able to talk about it to begin with. Not to mention, it has only been 2 hours on the same night that this happened. So now we move into the next night of April 22nd. And this is where things get a little bit more complicated for people trying to figure out what's really going on in Dover. Word has started to spread a little bit through the teenage community in this town. Bill was still kind of shaken from his encounter the night before. He started telling people about what he saw, but there's a crucial detail here that adds a little bit of a wrinkle to this section coming up. And that's that Bill had talked to his friend Will Tainer about this experience. And remember the name Will Tainer because that's going to be important here in a minute about what happens. So on the evening of April 22nd, Will picked up his girlfriend Abby Barabum for what was supposed to be a normal teenage date. They were going to go to a movie or get some dinner, something like that. And they were just driving around Dover, just talking, just being a young couple, just having a night out by themselves. This is when Abby has her sighting for the first time. And they're driving down Springdale Avenue when Abby spots something off the side of the road. Her breath catches in her throat as she sees this creature and she's reaching over, grabbing onto Will's arm because she's so scared of what she's seeing. The creature's maybe 25 feet away, close enough that the headlights are lighting it up pretty well for them to be able to see, but far enough away that it still is in that range of we're not 100% sure of what we're seeing. It's standing upright next to a tree, or maybe sitting, she wasn't entirely sure, but she does get a good look, and what she sees again matches the descriptions of the other two. She said the head is massive. She describes it as looking like a watermelon. The eyes are glowing, but this time they appear green, possibly reflection from the car's headlights. And the body looks like a baby's body with long arms and legs. And just like Bill described, these eyes are glowing with this just electric intensity that just seems to burn itself into you as you're looking at it. And the creature is staring again directly at her, not at the car, not at what's going on, but right at her, almost like it's staring into her soul. It's just kind of focused and fixated on looking at her. And it's that same weird, disturbing combination of infant-like proportions, but just stretched into impossible lengths and thinness. And like Bill and John, Abby notes there's a complete absence of facial features. There's no mouth, no nose, no ears, no hair, just smooth, tan-colored skin with glowing eyes. She initially thinks that it might be like an ape or something like that, but then she quickly realizes it's nothing she's ever seen before. And both Abby and Will estimate its size to be about the same size as a goat, roughly 3 to 4 feet tall. And the silence inside the car becomes almost oppressive. Abby's holding her breath and forces herself to exhale, and the sound kind of startled Will into coming back to his thoughts and realizing what was happening. And without really thinking, he just steps on the gas and speeds away as fast as he can to get away from this thing. And this whole encounter for them lasted only a couple seconds as well. It wasn't this long, drawn out thing, but it felt like they were staring for minutes or even hours of how just terrified and weird this thing made you feel in this instant. And the rest of their drive home is almost in near silence. Will's gripping the steering wheel as tightly as he can because he's so freaked out, and Abby keeps checking the side mirrors, kind of half expecting to see the green eyes behind them following them. And when they reach her house, Will parks, but he doesn't turn off the engine. Neither of them get out of the car. They just kind of sit there for a minute. And finally, Abby asks him, she says, what was that thing? And Will just kind of shakes his head, not in denial, but just kind of bewilderment that comes from having, your assumptions of reality kind of changed, just like, I don't know. I don't know what we saw. He heard Bill's story, but hearing something and then seeing it for yourself are two completely different experiences. And he now kind of understands how Bill felt when he was explaining what he saw and why he wrote that phrase, that I, Bill Bartlett, swear on a stack of Bibles I saw this creature. He understands why Bill felt compelled that he had to write this on the page to just kind of explain the truth of what you're feeling and what you saw. And Abby later makes her own sketch, and just like the other two, it shows a large-headed creature with an elongated body. You got 3 different teenagers, 3 different nights, and 3 nearly identical drawings of something that shouldn't exist, with no interaction among the kids to discuss this. These are 3 separate accounts. Now, after dropping Abby off at her house, Will should have gone straight home. He really should have just been like, I'm going home. I'm done with this. I'm just going to go to bed. He decides to pick up another friend and probably try to just kind of forget about what happened, try to have a normal night. Now, it's around 12:15 a.m. and Will turns onto Farm Street, which is the same stretch of road where Bill had seen the creature 24 hours earlier. And the coincidence isn't really lost on Will. He knows this is where Bill saw it, and he knows that this is where things happened. And as Will and his friend are driving, this friend remains nameless. We don't have his name in the record of who Will was driving with, but we do know he was with someone. And for just a split second, something flashes across the road in front of them. Nothing standing perched on a wall or next to a tree staring at them, but they just see something quick and small move across the road really quickly. Enough that they could notice that it was walking weird, but not enough that they could make out the real intimate details of it, but enough that they knew this was the same creature. They could tell the proportions and the weirdness of how it moved, that this was the same thing. And then with that 4th sighting, the Dover Demon encounters end. There's 4 teenagers, 4 separate sightings, all within 26 hours, all within kind of a 2-mile radius in this small town, and then just nothing. Then there's no other future sightings. Bill saw the creature on Farm Street. Will saw it cross Farm Street. John encountered it on Miller Hill Road, which was less than a mile away from Farm Street. And Abby's sighting on Springdale Avenue completes what appears to be kind of a straight line route through Dover's suburban landscape. It's almost like the creature had business in Dover, like a specific purpose that required it to travel from point A to point B to point C, and these 4 kids just happened to be in the right places at the wrong time. Whatever had visited this quiet Massachusetts town finished its business and moved on. really leaving behind only 4 shaken witnesses and a mystery that would just continue on for decades. So let's kind of walk through what these 4 kids described. They weren't particularly close friends, and they all describe encountering the same creature over the course of just 26 hours. And their descriptions are remarkably consistent. You have a small humanoid creature that's 3 to 4 feet tall. It's got this massive, disproportionate head, egg shaped, watermelon shaped, that big oval on top of its head. It's got glowing eyes, which are either orange or green, depending on who was seeing it. A thin, spindly body with long arms and legs, these tendril like fingers. It was completely hairless, had no visible nose, mouth, or ears, and its skin was peach or tan colored.
We all prefer things a certain way, like groceries. If you want groceries just how you like them, you gotta try Instacart. They have a new preference picker that lets you pick how ripe or unripe you want your bananas. Shoppers can see your preferences upfront, helping guide their choices. Because when it comes to groceries, the details matter. Instacart. Get groceries just how you like.
Now, within a week of these sightings, a man named Loren Coleman arrived in Dover. And Coleman was already a well-known cryptozoologist. He's actually the guy who came up with the term Dover demon. And he brought a team of investigators with him, including Walter Webb, who famously was a big part of the Betty and Barney Hill case, which was also in the Northeast, not really too far from Dover. But these weren't just random enthusiasts. They approached this case with a kind of scrutiny reserved for major criminal investigations. They interviewed the witnesses separately, tested their stories, and looked for inconsistencies. And Coleman's conclusion was that the witnesses were credible. He believed their accounts were not a hoax. He even investigated, one of the most obvious explanations is that it might have been, a young horse or a moose calf. They found no missing animals reported in the area and also pointed out that a moose in April would have been pretty large based on their mating habits and when they seasonally, give birth and grow. And also, moose are pretty rare in Massachusetts. And aside from Loren, the Dover Police Department conducted their own investigation as well. They found no physical evidence, no tracks, no hair samples, nothing. Their conclusion was that the sightings were probably a school vacation hoax or just a figment of their imagination. But the interesting part there, even though that was the official police position, the police chief himself vouched for the witnesses' credibility, and he called them good kids and reliable kids. Not kids that are troublemakers or that they would expect to try and pull a prank like this on the town. So there's this fascinating split. There's a professional cryptozoologist who believes the witnesses. The police officially dismiss it as a hoax, but personally vouch for the witnesses' character. And the witnesses themselves, they all passed polygraph tests. They maintained their stories consistently over decades, and they had no apparent motive to lie or conspire together. Again, these are teenage kids, from 15 to 17 years old. When kids are pressed for information, if they are lying, they are going to crack eventually, especially when you get the police involved. I have kids myself, and if I have to ask them something multiple times, eventually, if they are lying about what they're saying, that comes out. And I'm not pressing nearly as hard as a polygraph test and police investigators would be pushing these kids. And they consistently, over and over and over again, told the same story in the same details without wavering. But we do have to address the elephant in the room, which is that Bill had talked to Will before Abby's sighting. Does this contaminate her testimony? And does it suggest that at least part of this case could be explained by the power of suggestion? In any investigation, witness contamination is going to be a serious issue. And when one person's account influences another's perception, it can create this false consistency in testimonies. But there's several factors that do still support the witness's credibility, which first is Bill's initial encounter and John's independent sighting occurred before any communication between witnesses. The second, despite the potential for influence, Abby's account contained unique details like seeing green eyes instead of orange, suggesting that she wasn't simply repeating Bill's story. And third, as I mentioned earlier, They all maintained their accounts were genuine even under just intense scrutiny and polygraph testing. And that does have to hold some weight into the credibility of these kids. And on top of that, it is a well-documented fact that these kids were not great friends. Bill and Will talked because they were the same age, but they were not people who hung out with each other regularly. Abby and Will had a connection because they were dating, and then John was not part of this social circle at all. So for four seemingly minimally connected kids to come up with the idea of creating this hoax over their April vacation is a bit far-fetched that they would coordinate so well and maintain such consistent stories on a hoax that they created with just an acquaintance from school. So what was the Dover Demon? Over decades, researchers and skeptics have put out numerous theories, each with their own compelling arguments and glaring weaknesses. So let's dive into a couple of these possibilities and really kind of take a look at why this case has remained so, stubbornly unsolvable. So the first theory, and kind of the biggest and most popular theory, is that it was a misidentification of a different animal. It is the most common skeptical explanation, and it's really where any serious investigation of this has to start. The human brain is remarkably bad at processing unexpected visual information, especially in low light conditions. We are pattern recognition machines. We are always trying to fit new things into familiar things that we recognize. And more often than not, we do get it almost spectacularly wrong. And the most frequently suggested candidates for misidentification on this case are young ungulates, which are specifically, a moose calf or a young horse. In April, these animals would be relatively small, and in bad lighting conditions, their proportions could appear distorted. A young moose standing on its hind legs or a foal with a large head could potentially match some of what the witnesses were describing. But Loren Coleman investigated this angle thoroughly and found several problems with this. First of all, there was no missing animals reported in that area during the time period. And second, April in Massachusetts is still pretty cold, not the season where you would expect to find very young animals wandering around unsupervised without a parental unit of that species with them. Third, and most importantly, all of the witnesses described bipedal movement. The creature walked and ran on two legs, not four. Yes, a moose and a horse can stand up on their hind legs, but they are not going to run across the road and down a hill and into a gully on their hind legs. That they are just not going to do that. But if we dig a little deeper into the psychology of misidentification, when Bill Bartlett saw something on that stone wall, his brain had maybe about 3 seconds to process this unexpected image that came from his headlights. With stress and adrenaline, the human visual system can play some pretty crazy tricks. A raccoon or a large cat caught at an unusual angle could be interpreted as something far different than what it actually is. And the power of suggestion becomes a crucial part here. Because as we said, once Bill described a sighting to others, it created this kind of template for future encounter. If Will told Abby about Bill's experience, which is unknown if he did or did not, Will has said that he did not tell Abby, but we don't know for sure if that is true or not. He could have essentially primed her brain to see certain characteristics of what Bill described: a large head, glowing eyes, small stature. It doesn't mean Abby was lying or even consciously fabricating what she saw. Her brain may have filled in details because of what she was told prior, but yet she genuinely believes that's what she saw.
At Verbo, we understand that even the best of plans sometimes need a little support. So we plan for the plot twists. Every booking is automatically backed by our Verbo Care Guarantee, giving you confidence from the very start. Whenever you need help, it's ready. Before your stay, through the moments in between, and after your trip. Because a great trip starts with peace of mind. And maybe a good playlist. But we've got the peace of mind part covered.
But this theory struggles with the consistency of details across the witnesses, particularly John's account, which occurred before any witness contamination could have taken place. Then we move into the escaped exotic animal theory, which has gotten a little bit of traction over the years, particularly among people who want to find a naturalistic explanation that still accounts for the weird, unusual appearance. The most commonly suggested animal in this regard is a slow loris, which is a small primate that's native to Southeast Asia. They do have several characteristics that match the Dover demon. They're small, about 2 to 3 feet tall, but they have proportionately large heads. But they move in a distinctive way that could appear unnatural to people who haven't seen them before. Most interestingly, though, is they have a tapetum lucidum, which is a reflective layer in their eyes that can cause them to glow orange or yellow in artificial light. So that could explain the height and the weird movement and the glowing eyes, but the heads don't match up to the Dover demon description. And this theory is compelling because it explains several aspects of the sightings. Its apparent comfort with climbing, where it was seen clinging to the stone walls and wrapping its feet around rocks, kind of matches primate behavior. The weird gait or walk that they described, it could be the slow loris's kind of unique movement that American observers wouldn't really be used to seeing. But there are problems with this theory too, because in 1977, exotic pet ownership was far less common than today. And slow lorises were extremely rare in private collections on top of that. Not only was exotic pet ownership rare, but of those who did have exotic pets, the slow loris was even more rare. So how would this creature end up in Dover? And why was it never reported missing or recaptured or found dead? Despite the media attention and coverage that followed after these couple days. Other animals have been proposed over the years. Maybe a young orangutan or gibbon could potentially match the size and movement patterns. Some people have suggested escaped lab animals, maybe experimental specimens from nearby research facilities such as MIT or Harvard, who both have extensive research programs. And in the 1970s, animal testing regulations were a lot less strict than they are now. But this theory also has to take into account the environmental factors, because in April in Massachusetts, you can still regularly see overnight temperatures in the 30s and 40s. I am in the Northeast as well, and in April, we get snowstorms. It can very easily get a week in April where the high temperature is 15 degrees and it's snowing. It's not super common, but it can happen. And pretty much every night up through May is at or near freezing for the most part. So most tropical primates wouldn't really survive too long in those conditions without some sort of shelter. So where was the creature living? What was it eating? How did it avoid anyone else in Dover seeing it, except these 4 specific kids on these specific circumstances? So moving from, a misidentification or a exotic animal misidentification, for cryptozoology enthusiasts, it could represent, a possibility of an undiscovered species, maybe a remnant left over from a previously unknown primate or an entirely new primate that we had never seen before. This theory would suggest that somewhere in the forests of Massachusetts, there is a small population of these creatures that has managed to survive undetected. Proponents point out that new species are discovered regularly, even in well-studied regions. In 2020, researchers found a new species of mouse in Ecuador. In 2019, a new primate species was discovered in Myanmar. So if we're still finding new mammals in explored regions, there could be possibility that there's something in the dense woodlands of New England. But the anatomical challenges to this are significant. The Dover demons describe physiology, the massive head on this thin neck. There was no visible breathing apparatus, no nose, no mouth. Having naked skin in near freezing temperatures doesn't align well with known biological principles that we have. The head to body ratio described by the witnesses would create severe structural problems for any real animal. The neck just couldn't support that amount of weight. And the brain size implied by the large skull would require a lot of caloric intake, which the smaller body couldn't really support. Some people have suggested that it might represent a previously unknown branch of primate evolution, but this again raises even more questions. How did this species remain hidden? Which niche does it fall in? Where are any fossil remains of any other ones? The population is a problem just as challenging as the idea to begin with. For any species to survive, it needs a breeding population. How large would a sustainable Dover demon population need to be? And then, where are they living? What are they eating? How have they avoided leaving any trace of evidence? No hair, no bones, no feeding signs, in an area that's been thoroughly explored over and over, and there's been no other witness to this. It was these 2 days, these 4 kids. None before, none after. Now, the next theory, and my personal favorite, is the alien visitor theory, which might sound far-fetched, but it addresses some of the most puzzling aspects of this case. The oversized head, small body, minimal facial features except for large eyes, and apparent intelligence matches what is the stereotypical gray alien image that most people have. And coincidentally, these sightings occurred in April of 1977, which was just 8 months before Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, which popularized the gray alien view in, our American culture. So these witnesses described something that matched a cultural icon of aliens that didn't exist yet in popular consciousness. It's very similar to the Betty and Barney Hill situation that we talked about last week, where they described a gray alien before people knew what a gray alien was. And this detail is important because it suggests that these kids weren't unconsciously pulling from information they had seen elsewhere. In 1977, pop culture's aliens were still basically the little green men stereotype, kind of from Marvin the Martian type aliens, or like the bug-eyed monsters from old 50s B-movie level aliens. The Dover Demon's appearance anticipated what would become kind of the dominant alien archetype by several months. The behavioral patterns of this creature fit into extraterrestrial theories. It appeared suddenly and was active for just a short amount of time, only 26 hours, and it followed what appears to be a deliberate route across town, and then it just vanished completely. This kind of suggests a purposeful activity rather than just random wandering of a lost animal. That intelligent stare that a couple of the kids reported, kind of that sense of being watched or studied, just kind of implies an intelligence that exceeds what we would expect from an escaped pet or a cow or a moose or a horse. And also, Massachusetts in the 1970s had quite a bit of UFO activity. There was numerous unexplained aerial sightings throughout the decade, and some researchers suggest that the Dover Demon might have been just an alien reconnaissance mission where the creature was just gathering information about suburban American life before returning to its craft. But this does come into the same evidence problem that plagues kind of all alien cases. If advanced beings are capable of interstellar travel and visited Dover, why did they leave no technology, no clear evidence, no proof of their presence? But again, this goes hand in hand with most alien sightings. There's not usually any proof left behind. Sometimes there will be markings on the ground, sometimes there's not. But it is usually just a short time window with a couple witnesses that no one else ever saw. And then we get into the collective hallucination that once Bill Bartlett reported his sighting, it might have created a kind of psychological kind of contagion. Other teenagers, primed by his description, caught up in the excitement and fear, might have interpreted normal shadows or animals or environmental things as matching his creature. But this theory doesn't explain some of the specific consistent details among the witnesses, and particularly it doesn't explain John's sighting. If it was just Bill and then the next day Will and Abby, this would make a lot more sense. But going from Bill to John 2 hours apart the same night with no contact in between, then to Will and Abby, It doesn't give any kind of evidence saying Bill led these other people to see what he was describing because John saw it before Bill told anybody. Unless we then go into the elaborate hoax theory, which was this coordinated deception between these four kids, possibly with costumes or props or staged encounters to either fool witnesses or investigators or both. The timing and location patterns could support this. The sightings occurred during a spring vacation when teenagers had more free time. They followed a logical pattern that could have been planned out with a route down certain streets. And the whole absence of physical evidence could indicate just careful planning to avoid leaving any traces. Elaborate pranks weren't uncommon among young kids in the 1970s, and creating a local monster legend could have been something that seemed like harmless fun that just kind of got a little out of hand when investigators and media became involved with it. But this hoax theory does face several challenges too, like we mentioned before. The witnesses all passed polygraph tests and maintained consistent stories. And second, there was kind of a lack of motive. None of them wanted any fame or profit from this, and no one ever confessed. In over 50 years, no one has come forward to admit that they were part of this. Almost everything that is a hoax eventually comes out to be a hoax. The Patterson-Gimlin film, whether you believe it's a hoax or not, Gimlin has said that it was hoaxed. Now, there is question marks of whether he's telling the truth of it being a hoax, but someone tried to take credit for it. The Nessie photo from Loch Ness has been proven to be a hoax. Multiple alien abduction stories have proven to be hoaxes. Usually, if someone went through the effort to hoax this, they want to get some sort of recognition at some point for it. Maybe not in a year, maybe not in 2 years, but 50 years later, we probably would have heard someone trying to take credit for it at some point. And maybe most importantly, this would have required some remarkable coordination among multiple kids who barely even knew each other. Perfect execution without leaving a trace, and a lifelong commitment to sticking to their stories, even in the face of professional interrogation, polygraph tests, multiple police and media investigators, all sticking to the same story forever. But then, interesting, there is one more angle worth kind of exploring, and that's that the Dover Demon might be connected to a much older Native American folklore, which is the Pukwudgie. And I'm sorry if I am butchering the way that is pronounced, but that is the best that I can come up with. But Pukwudgies are part of the Wampanoag and Delaware Native American folklore. They're described as these small, humanoid forest creatures, and they've been part of the regional traditions for centuries. They're typically about 2 to 3 feet tall, remarkably close to the size of the Dover Demon. And both creatures are described as humanoid, but with pretty distinct non-human features and proportions. Now, the geographical overlap of this is pretty significant. The Dover Demon appeared in Dover, Massachusetts. The Pukwudgies are said to inhabit forests throughout Massachusetts, particularly the Freetown Fall River State Forest. And this shared regional association has led a lot of cryptozoologists to wonder if modern Dover Demon sightings might represent encounters with creatures that indigenous people have known about for generations. The behavior descriptions do share some interesting parallels. The Pukwudgies are described as intelligent, mischievous beings with these supernatural abilities, including invisibility and shapeshifting. And the Dover Demon witnesses consistently reported this sense of intelligence in the creature's behavior, feeling like being studied or assessed rather than just being looked at by a frightened animal. But there are some significant differences that complicate this. The Pukwudgies are described as goblin-like with gray skin, large ears, noses, fingers, sometimes resembling porcupines from behind. And the Dover Demon's description with the smooth, peachy skin with the massive bald head and minimal facial features, it doesn't really match that description. But what makes the Dover Demon case so really enduringly puzzling is that no single theory really adequately explains everything. Each hypothesis addresses some things and fails to account for others. The misidentification handles the lack of physical evidence but struggles with the witness consistency. The exotic animal hypothesis explains the creature's behavior but not its ability to survive in that environment. The alien theory addresses some of the anatomical concerns but lacks supporting evidence with it. And the hoax theory accounts for the absence of proof but can't explain the witness's lifelong consistency. Maybe there's some truth in some sort of combination of these factors. An unusual animal sighting, amplified by suggestion, darkness, teenage psychology, and then just kind of crystallized into legend through the media attention and the community and all of that. Or possibly something completely unknown and unexplained visited Dover, Massachusetts for just 26 hours in April of 1977. My personal opinion is that it was Roger the Alien from American Dad. Because if you look at Roger the Alien's character on American Dad, he is pretty much spot on to the drawings of these three kids. So whether Seth MacFarlane got his inspiration for Roger from this case, or maybe Seth knows something we don't. Family Guy is set in Rhode Island, which is not too far from Dover. So possibly Roger is the Dover demon. I like that theory. That is a good one for me, and that's what we're going to go with, is that Roger the Alien is soft disclosure on the Dover demon. Thank you guys so much. I hope you liked this episode. I had a lot of fun putting this one together. This one came kind of by request, but not even really request, but more of a, hey, if you do this episode, we'd love to take a look at it. And I said, cool, I'm doing it next week, and I'm going to give you guys a shout out. So this goes out to our buddies over at the podcast Weirder After Dark. They are a great show, covers all things New England weird. So if you live in that area or you're interested in this kind of stuff, take a look at them. I love that show. It's a great show. And take a look at their Dover Demon episode as well. You can get kind of another spin on the tale. And as always, if you like the show, please just go give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify, or share the show with your friends, share it on Facebook. Get those little fake $100 bills and stick it in something. And then when they open up, it says, check out Paranormal Directive 13. That would be fantastic. That's something that I need to print up and start passing those out. As always, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/paranormaldirective13. We have the Thursday mini episodes. We are adding the new show on Mondays. It didn't come out this Monday. It will be out this coming Monday. So take a look for that on there. And then follow all the social media. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram at Paranormal Directive 13. TikTok, I have kind of a multi-part post going on where I got cursed by the Annabelle doll and decided to, instead of apologizing, I just doubled down and called out Robert and Peggy as well. So I'm kind of documenting on there, if I get any more bad luck or if things get better. And right now it's leaning towards the more bad luck because now the wheel bearing on my car is broken. I post every day on the social media stuff outside of doing the weekly podcast on here. And if there's anything else you want me to cover, send an email, paranormaldirective13@gmail.com. Let me know. I'd love to take a look at stuff, maybe some lesser known things that a lot of people haven't heard of. Those are always fun to cover. And I'm really looking forward to kind of exploring some more unknown areas and things like that. And remember, guys, if you're driving through Dover and you see Roger cross the street in front of you, just let him be. He's cool. He's not a problem. Have a good night.